We're very honored to have with us today Rabbi Arik Ascherman, who was brought to our attention and suggested to us by Susanna Heschel, Professor Susanna Heschel, to whom we gave the honor of introducing him today. However, she met with an accident and has a broken ankle and is laid up. And so she wrote these words that I will read. They are her words. We are here today to celebrate Dr. King and to remember the extraordinary miracle that took place in this country thanks to his leadership. Hardened hearts melted, the U.S. Congress legislated freedom, and walls tumbled down. Those who lived during those years are forever changed, and those who live today and aspire to create new miracles are bringing to life the great heritage of the prophets. Arik Ascherman is such a person. Although prophecy may have ceased within the Jewish framework, the lessons of the biblical prophets remain very much alive and relevant to us today. Who were those great figures of antiquity whose words continue to disturb our complacency, challenge our conscience, and whose message transformed this nation? My father wrote that the prophets combined very deep love, very powerful dissent, painful rebuke with unwavering hope. They were religious people with deep faith that God is either the creator of all human beings or of no human beings. They were people of enormous courage and integrity, and their example stands before us to this day. Prophets were not calm. They raged at injustice and felt the agony of those who live in poverty and discrimination, tormented by the cruelties of injustice, corruption, and hatred. We are not prophets, but we've been given the gift of knowing their teachings and their passion. My father once wrote, "The opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference." To be human means to be concerned for other human beings. This is the lesson of the prophets. Rabbi Arik Ascherman puts his own life in jeopardy to save the homes of Palestinians. He stands up on behalf of refugees from Africa. He goes to jail to protect the economic and legal rights of those who are not treated fairly. And he does this as a Jew, a rabbi, in the name of the great Jewish tradition of human rights, economic fairness, and due legal process. He educates, he protests, he goes to court, he demonstrates, and in so doing, he also preserves the integrity of the great Jewish prophetic tradition. With him, we have hope that the future will one day bring a miracle to Israel and Palestine. And God has hope that the human beings he created will one day live as he would like. Rabbi Ascherman, we welcome you to Dartmouth College.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. In the short, brief time I have, I would like to, I've been asked to say a few words about our work, and of course I want to relate that to the legacy of Martin Luther King. In 2008, we in Israel celebrated our 60th anniversary. This was a time of great celebration for us, a time to give thanks for the fact that after 2,000 years of oppression, we again had some control over our own destiny because we again were living in our homeland. At the same time, we know that what was a time of great celebration for us as Israelis is for others the Nakba, the great disaster. And since I don't have enough time, I'll cut down my usual 5-hour talk to simply say that regarding Palestinians, and as you'll hear in a minute, that's just one piece of what we do, our goal is to bring a little bit closer to fruition the promise that God makes time after time in the book of Genesis, that through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. If today what is a blessing for us is a curse for others, we want to get to a win-win situation, and what is a blessing for us is a blessing shared by all. On the occasion of our 60th anniversary, we issued a series of 2 radio ads, each with a part of the recording of our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, reading out, as he did in 1948, from our Declaration of Independence. And the first you hear him say that the country will be mushtetet, the very foundation of its existence will be cherut, tzedek, v'shalom, freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. And in the second you hear him say that the country will guarantee total social and political equality for all, regardless of religion, nationality, or gender. And our ads went on to say, we had this dream 60 years ago, now 64 years ago. Not what other people expected of us, but we were dreaming for ourselves. Where have we succeeded, and where have we not yet succeeded? We didn't say where we failed. 60 or even 64 years is not a long time as countries go, but where have we not yet succeeded? Because if we're honest with ourselves, for all the wonderful things that we have accomplished in Israel, we haven't yet fully lived up to our dream, certainly in the field of human rights. But here we are in an interfaith gathering, and some of you may be asking, well, what did the prophets have to say about freedom, justice, and peace? We all like to quote the prophet Isaiah, which we heard a few minutes ago, about beating swords into plowshares. And we kind of rather forget about the prophet Joel, who talked about beating plowshares into swords. One of the most amazing video clips I have from a few years back was we were out with a television crew from ABC Australia, and we caught 2 Israelis in the act of stealing olives from Palestinian-owned trees. And out there in the middle of the olive groves, this bizarre, surreal debate develops. I'm wearing a kippah, a Jewish head covering, so are they. We're all religious Jews. And we start talking about the seemingly esoteric topic of what the Jewish tradition has to say about the property rights of non-Jews in the land of Israel. Seems esoteric, except for in our part of the world where religion is such a powerful force, it isn't so esoteric. Nobody was listening to each other all that carefully. It wasn't a very productive discussion. And at a certain point, in a very mocking way, one of them says to me, well, you must be reading from a warped Torah scroll. And I must admit, I more or less descended to their level when I answered in kind, I think you're right. I think I am reading from a different Torah scroll than yours. Mine has things that seem to be missing from yours, like don't steal, don't trespass. The point is that if our first mandate in Rabbis for Human Rights is to try to prevent or redress human rights abuses, then our second and no less important mandate is to try to introduce into the intellectual universe of our fellow Israelis another way of understanding Torah, of understanding our Jewish tradition, different from the one that is most commonly heard, unfortunately, today in Israel. The way I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, it was simply assumed that a basic part of what it means to be a Jew, as I'm sure that many of you feel about your faith traditions, is to be concerned about universal human rights and social justice. It's what I heard from my rabbis, from my parents, from my teachers. I was raised on the stories of the Jews who stood shoulder to shoulder with African Americans in the civil rights movement. And so when I first spent some time in Israel, now I'll date myself a bit, my first greatest shock was to find out that bagels were not readily available. What kind of Jewish state is this if you can't get bagels? Not a problem anymore, but my more profound shock was when I found out that these values, which were so axiomatic that I would never have considered of questioning, which polls show are widely held in the American Jewish community, were not necessarily shared by all Israelis, particularly religious Israelis. Rabbis for Human Rights was founded during the First Intifada by Rabbi David Foreman. And at the time, there was more sympathy by average Israelis for Palestinians than, let's say, in the Second Intifada. There was less violence, less terror. Many average Israelis who weren't particularly political or activists or left-wing simply felt that moral red lines had been crossed. Among rabbis, there was a feeling that there needed to be a Jewish rabbinic response to what was happening in our society. And Rabbi Foreman wrote an open letter to the chief rabbinate saying, "Why is it that the religious establishment in this country seems only concerned with Sabbath observance and with kashrut, our Jewish dietary laws? As important as these things are, where are the Abraham Joshua Heschels, the father of Dr. Susanna Heschel, running around this country and crying Gewalt and speaking to some of the burning moral issues of our society?" Rabbi Heschel, the descendant of a long line of Hasidic rabbis, saved from the Holocaust, spent most of his career in this country writing and teaching and books that meant so much to me. But he didn't just write and stay in the ivory tower. He was one of the first to speak out about the Jews of the former Soviet Union. He was one of the people behind the scenes that led to Nostra Aetate, the clauses in Vatican II that brought about some rapprochement between the Jewish and Catholic communities worldwide. He was very active, struggling against the Vietnam War, and his picture hangs on our wall, marching with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama. And when he was asked after that, as many people have heard, what it was like to march with Martin Luther King in Selma, his answer was, "I felt like my feet were praying." And Rabbi Heschel is our role model of a rabbi and a scholar who is also a social activist. We work sometimes through the courts, sometimes through the press, sometimes a direct field work, sometimes lobbying our government, our Knesset, and sometimes when all else fails, through acts of civil disobedience. I myself, as was mentioned, have stood trial for standing in front of bulldozers, coming to demolish Palestinian homes, not for any security reason, but because of a catch-22 situation in which if you're a Palestinian, you can have a clean security record, you can have an uncontested title to your land, you can stand on your head, and in most cases you will not get a legal building permit because of a catch-22 situation, intentional manipulation of building and zoning laws to make it almost impossible to get that permit, and when you build without that permit, your home can be demolished. Now, I said a few minutes ago, or I should have, at least, that Israel is a very strong democracy. In many ways, I think inside Israel, I'm not talking about the occupation for the moment, but inside Israel is a stronger democracy than the United States. And in a democracy, civil disobedience must be a matter of last resort, not first resort. To do civil disobedience every time we disagree with something, that would be chaos. And we do in Israel have democratic institutions to try to change those things with which we disagree. But as Rabbi Heschel would say so often, in a democratic society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. And so seeing that bulldozer coming to tear into that home, the father of the household clutching at his heart as he's about to have a heart attack, the women tearing at their hair and pleading with us to do something, and knowing that the worst is yet to come, the moment I would not wish on my worst enemies. And that's the moment the children come home. They went off to school and they had a home, and now there's rubble. Seeing that Torah, which I as a rabbi am sworn to uphold, being ground into the rubble along with that home. And that image of God that we're all supposed to be honoring being banished from that place. There comes a certain point where one has no choice but to stand in front of the bulldozers. There were some amazing moments during that trial. First of all, it is not easy for Jewish leaders abroad to speak what they may feel in their hearts, concerned all too often that people that don't have Israel's best interests at heart may twist their words in ways they did not intend. And so when over 400 rabbis signed an open letter to our prime minister, this was very moving. And then it turned out that the day the trial opened, that week was the week of Martin Luther King's birthday. That year, according to the Jewish Hebrew calendar, it was the yahrzeit of the death of Rabbi Heschel. And in our weekly cycle of Torah readings in the Jewish tradition, that was the week that we read the first verses of the book of Exodus, of perhaps the first example of civil disobedience in history, that of the Hebrew midwives who disobeyed the commands of Pharaoh to save the Jewish babies. And if I can leave one message and one thought today, it was what I realized when I understood the import of the fact that this was the day our trial was opening. We may not have the vision or the charisma of a Martin Luther King. We don't all have the spiritual audacity and insight of a Rabbi Heschel. We may not have the courage of the Hebrew midwives, but we can and we must stand on the shoulders of these spiritual giants. It is wonderful to gather here today and celebrate the life of Martin Luther King, to invoke his memory. But if we really want to honor his memory, we must carry on his legacy. And even when we find ourselves so woefully inadequate, let us all remember that all of us can stand on the shoulders of giants. And then it turned out that the day that I would take the stand in my own behalf fell between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, one of the most holy times on our Jewish calendar. And as I said to the judge, from the moment that I knew that this was the day that I would take the stand, what kept on ringing through my head are those words we say just before the Kol Nidrei prayer on Yom Kippur, where we say, "V'yeshiva shomala u'v'yeshiva shomata." In the earthly court above, in the heavenly court above, in the earthly court below, we can all pray together on this most holy of eves. And I said to the judge, in a few days it will be Yom Kippur. We believe that every single human soul on this planet is being judged on that day. And therefore, in the Yeshiva Shomala, in the heavenly court, we ask that God move from sitting on the throne of strict justice and move and sit in judgment while sitting on the throne of mercy and compassion. How can we ask that of God in the Yeshiva Shomala? If in the Yeshivot Shomata, if in the earthly courts and institutions in which we are responsible, both for justice and for mercy, if we don't do the same. And I reminded the judge that in the Bible, in the original Hebrew, tzedakah umishpat, justice and law are synonyms. Unfortunately, in our life, in our world, that's not always the case. So I had the prosecuting attorney in tears that day, but the judge remained rather aloof, and she was the one that counted. So we were convicted, although then unconvicted, when the prosecution said it should be expunged for community service. Everyone thought I should do community service by rebuilding Palestinian homes, but the judge didn't go for that either. But having not received justice in the court of law, our first act was to go and rebuild and lay a cornerstone to help rebuild one of those homes we'd been trying to defend. And then we did rebuild it. And for a year, I could have taken you to visit that home, the family, again, living in the dignity of a home, to see the housewarming gift that we brought for the family, a grapevine and a fig tree, Of course, in the words of the prophet Micah, "Vayashvu ish tachat kafno v'takatenato," that every person should sit under their vine and under their fig tree, and none should make them afraid. That's what we want for every human being, that no Israeli should live in fear of terror, and no Palestinian should live in fear of having their homes arbitrarily demolished. It was demolished a year later, but we've rebuilt it, and it stands. And we don't just do this endless Sisyphean cycle. Today, we're working in court to attack the very system of discriminatory planning, using Israel's democratic institutions to end this system which leads to home demolitions. On principle, Rabbis for Human Rights is always involved in at least one issue dealing with the human rights of Jewish Israelis, and at least one issue dealing with the human rights of non-Jews who are part of our society or under control. We deal with education. We educate young Israelis about Judaism and human rights. We believe that socioeconomic justice is a human right. We're perhaps most famous or infamous for the work that we do on behalf of Palestinians. But remember, as Dr. King taught us, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And for us, the Israeli single-parent mom opening up the empty refrigerator is just as much a human rights issue as the Palestinians that we're trying to protect. We, a few years ago, defeated what was called the Israeli-Wisconsin Plan, a lovely idea, if you remember the Wisconsin Plan from this country, to get people off welfare into the workforce, but done through the Lashon Hara, thinking evilly and poorly about people, because in these programs, the problem isn't unemployment, it's the unemployed. And therefore, you have a carrot and stick approach in which if you're uncooperative, you get all your benefits cut. And we were able to defeat that program eventually, but on the way, in the community service center we set up in Hadera in the middle of the country, one day this woman comes in to say thank you. A young, healthy-looking woman. It looks like she should be out working. She had a very difficult to diagnose psychological issue, and she had everybody fooled. The psychologist was fooled at first. The legal aid wouldn't take the case. They said it's impossible, it's not worth our time. Her own family wanted to throw her out of the house. They said, "You're not carrying your weight." We were the only people that believed in this woman. It took us 2 years, an unheard of 4 appeals committees. And we eventually got her benefits back and maybe a little bit of her dignity as well. Now, we exist on public funds. Was it a good use of those funds to spend 2 years and so many resources on an impossible-to-win case? No, it wasn't. But as we know, social justice is not always achieved through logical cost-benefit analysis. And as we're taught in the Talmud, one who saves a single life, it is if one has saved an entire world. And every human being is an entire world. In the occupied territories, we have succeeded. For example, if in 2002, Palestinians and those of us trying to protect them were being shot at, beaten, threatened, attacked, you name it, as we acted as human shields between farmers and settlers trying to prevent them from getting to their olive groves. The good news is that in 2006, we won a high court victory so that today, Palestinian farmers are getting to lands they couldn't get to for 2, 5, 10, 15 years, and with the Israeli army protecting them to do so. But sometimes I meet soldiers and they're angry, they're resentful. Why has my commander said my job today is to protect Palestinians? Who knows who among them has lost a loved one or an army buddy, and they're saying, now I have to protect their human rights? That's an emotionally impossible thing to ask of anybody. And you can think of the parallels from the Palestinian side. But that's what you have to do. There's a midrash, a form of rabbinic commentary written by the rabbis almost 2,000 years ago. If you remember the story in the Bible of Hagar and Ishmael being banished into the desert, dying of thirst. According to the Bible, God prepares a well and saves them. But according to the midrash, before God does that, the angels come to God and say, "What are you doing?" Don't you know all the troubles the Jewish people are going to suffer from the children of Ishmael throughout history? Let them die. Just end it all right here. According to the Midrash written by the rabbis, God says no. God knows that no future is inevitable. And God says, Basher Husham, right now in front of me is an innocent child. We too, who are created in God's image, and therefore have to be as godlike as humanly possible, we too have to distinguish between the terrorist coming to murder my children, and I have had bombs go off not far from my home, and that family that simply wants to put a roof over their heads or harvest their olives. And finally, it all comes down to hope. Because the polls show a consistent majority of Israelis and Palestinians who want a compromise, negotiated agreement, and even a larger percentage on both sides that say, we want peace, they don't. So what's the incentive to move forward? I don't know how many times when I've gone to rebuild a Palestinian home and Palestinian parents have insisted that we meet their children, that their children meet us. And like deja vu, the same conversation. My 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. What do we say to our 10-year-old son when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? We want our son to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis who come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it we correctly get upset when we hear about propaganda being taught about Israelis in Palestinian schools? It's because we know that even if we sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty can't last. And the only way I and my children and my society are going to survive is if we therefore break down those stereotypes. And therefore, who is really doing more for Israel's long-term security interests? The people that demolish homes and uproot trees and steal olives and steal land. I didn't even have a chance to talk about our legal team that returns land to the rightful owners. Or those of us who rebuild the homes and replant the trees and help pick the olives and return the land to its owners. Yes, I think what we're doing is a just and right and Jewish thing to do. But if you want to be perfectly honest, I also think it's a self-interested thing to do. The single best thing I can do to help my children. And the real Zionism today is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong, but is morally strong and lives up to our highest Jewish values. And it takes faith. I think it's significant. I'm sure that Martin Luther King had his moments of doubt. But in the big picture, Martin Luther King, for all of the oppression and racism that he was facing, did not give up on America. And I'll tell you a little story, a secret. When I was in high school, believe it or not, I played football. That's an exaggeration, because in 4 years, I was maybe in the game for 4 plays. My high school varsity coach was a Schreier. He would shout, cry, exhort, foam at the mouth. And he said, I only shout at the players that can be better football players. In 3 years of varsity football, he never shouted at me once. There was nothing this man could possibly have done to have made me into a better football player. And so there are those who say that we're traitors and we're anti-Israel, or that Martin Luther King was anti-American. But the fact is that when we shout, and when we try, and when we express our pain, and when we try out of love to make things a little bit better, we are actually, that's the deepest possible act of faith. It's an expression of the Jewish belief that people can change and live up to their highest selves. Otherwise, we'd be wasting our breath. April 15th, 2004, tax day in America. I'm at the village of Bidu, one of the 8 villages, Israeli democracy in action. They go to the high court and they win to get the route of the separation barrier moved. On this day, I'm at a demonstration, and at the end, I get a phone call to come to another neighborhood because a 13-year-old boy has been caught by the border police. He's being beaten. I and 2 other Israelis make our way to where this is happening, and the border police are shooting tear gas at us. The other 2 go back. I'm the only one stupid enough to keep on going forward. And when I get there, the commander beckons me forward, then grabs me by the throat, shakes me violently, headbutts me, starts screaming, "You're arrested. You understand you're arrested." I didn't know why, but I certainly knew I was arrested at that point. I see this young boy strapped to a windshield of a Jeep, shivering in fear, unsuccessfully trying to hold back the tears. Another man sent by the worried parents is handcuffed in front of the second Jeep. The same was done with me. The Palestinian youth, who could have decided not to throw stones at their own, started throwing stones, hitting the Jeeps we're forced to be in front of, and for the next couple hours were used as human shields. Now, I finished with this story for 2 reasons. First of all, I was inundated with the press afterwards, and because Israel has great freedom of the press, people with press cards got this all on film. It was around the world. As someone who gives every waking hour just about to fighting Israeli injustice, I'm opposed to double standards. And I started getting uneasy. I said to some of these reporters, "You're obsessing on this. It's not like it only could have happened in Israel." 2 weeks after that, the first revelations about Abu Ghraib came out. And the other reason I tell this story is because who knows what psychological scars that young boy will have for the rest of his life. He was waking up with nightmares every night for at least a month. Who knows what he's thinking about all Israelis, maybe all Jews. But when he gave an affidavit to our fellow human rights organization, B'Tselem, after describing all the horrific things that happened to him, he concluded by saying, and then a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue and told me not to be afraid. The work that we do has its dangers. Like on that day, on many occasions, being beaten up by Israeli security forces. I've been attacked by settlers, and it's equal opportunity out there. I've had my car stoned by Palestinians. And the work is not fun. As a rabbi, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a Zionist, there is no great pleasure in dealing every day with the deepest, darkest corners of the country that I love, that I've built a home in, married an Israeli, raising children. But when you know things are happening in the country that you love that you would not want to believe are possible, you have a choice. You can stick your head in the sand and saying it's not happening, I don't want to know. You can go to the opposite extreme and say this is a terrible, apartheid, racist place, ain't me, babe, I want nothing to do with it. We don't do that either, because it is of us. It's not somebody else. It's our country, our people. The third possibility is to take the pain we're feeling at things that we would not want to believe are possible, to push us forward to do what we call tikkun olam, which some Christians call co-creationism, to be God's partners in making this world just a little bit better. When Rabbi Heschel, just a few days before his death, gave a television interview, at the end, he asked to deliver a message to young people. And looking out at the world he would never see, he said, "Remember that your life has meaning and that every deed counts." Another place he says, "It's in sacred deeds that we meet God." And so my hope is that, and my prayer is that we shall always have the courage, the strength to find the way to stand on the shoulders of the giants, of the kings and the Heschels and the midwives that have come before us, midwifing us into a better future. May we find that place of faith to always believe that our deeds count, they have meaning, and they can make a difference. And yes, we all have those days when we wake up in the morning saying, "Why am I doing this? What's the point of it all? Does it really make a difference? Couldn't a nice Jewish boy do something better than stand in front of bulldozers?" But our Talmud has a wonderful image. And we're taught to look at all of life as two perfectly balanced scales, that is a burden and a promise. Because on both the personal and cosmic levels, we never know what little act that we take that seems meaningless, pointless, irrelevant, ineffective at the time, whether that will be the act that tips those scales one way or the other. And so my closing hope and wish and prayer and blessing for all of us, whether it be the Middle East or civil rights or any of the other spheres of our personal and public and spiritual lives, is that we should always have the courage and the wisdom and the faith to tip those scales in the right direction. Keni Yiratzon, may it be God's will.